there's somebody that we cringe at the idea of being associated with. I think that that's something that we need to really take a long, hard look at our response to that.
Look at the churches built, Catholic churches built in like the 60s, 70s, 80s, when I was coming of age. Von Balthasar, one of my favorite theologians, called them the great barns of the Reformation. And what he meant was it was a new iconoclasm. It was denuding these buildings of symbolism, imagery, narrativity, color. Great big brick, empty, kind of Bauhaus modernist buildings. Well, I went to Europe to study, to get my doctorate. I went to Paris. And Chartres, Notre Dame, and the Sainte-Chapelle, and the Rouen Cathedral, and Reims, and Amiens. And here's this poor kid growing up in 1970s America, where church buildings were meant to be, oh no, stark, brick. No, get rid of the pictures, get rid of that. It was a very rationalistic way to build church buildings. But then you go to Europe, and these buildings are they're crawling with symbolism and iconography and color and narrativity and so on. And I remember realizing very consciously, I'm a, 29-year-old guy, I'm in Paris thinking, man, something went wrong. Something went wrong with the Catholic spirit.
You can see it. Because we have so many churches. And so you can see the decline, and how in the 50s and 60s it was starting, and then it accelerated to these monstrous things, these monstrous, just horrible buildings that
so you agree with me?
No one cares about, no one likes them, everybody hates them. And there's something even more, even not just the images, but the actual transformation of the space from a traditional hierarchical space. This desire to eliminate this three-part structure of the church, which is the same as the temple.
The temple, right?
One of the oldest structures in, it's this old, even pagan temples are made this way. This sense of entering into the mystery and flattening everything. So the flattening of the symbolism ended up being the same flattening of culture that happened all around.
But when you cut off the mystical sources as superstitious, and then you say, we're going to just hang on to these great social justice principles, well, then we become an echo of the culture, and then who cares? And if our buildings look like they could be banks or they could be, purely secular spaces, who's going to be interested? But when you've got a Chartres cathedral that looks like it's landed from another world, which indeed it has, right? I love the fact that Kenneth Clark, one of my great heroes, did Civilization many years ago, the great art historian. And he was at Chartres, and he said, keep in mind, this was all painted in vivid colors. And he said how much even more fiercely Tibetan it would have looked. And it's always struck me that, imagine Chartres, not just sort of blank, but alive with color. It landed from another world. And you're meant to be drawn into this world transforming vision of everything. If our churches and our behavior and our self-understanding is just a vague echo of the culture, everyone's going to get bored. And of course, young people will stay away in droves, but they will be attracted. I'm glad you mentioned the Word on Fire gang, because I do have all these extraordinary young people, super smart, very artistic, hyper motivated. They won't be turned on. I called it beige Catholicism years ago. When I first got back from my doctoral studies, I began writing, and I wrote a little essay about beige Catholicism, that we've allowed our colors to bleed into this bland beige. Well, no one's going to be interested. I wanted something fiercely Tibetan about our Catholicism. I wanted it to be edgy and colorful and challenging.
We're lucky in Montreal. Have you been to Notre Dame Basilica in Montreal?
Yeah, sure.
It's as if you feel that you are in Chartres in the Middle Ages. They have the ceilings painted with gold stars, and all the pillars are ornamented and everything. And you think like, wow, I can project this into space and know what it would have been like to stand in these medieval cathedrals.
Bishop Barron and Johnathan Pageau are talking about the beige box churches, and that, why did we build beige box churches? Because it's economical, and it's not frivolous, and it's a gathering place for people to have community. And they are saying that it is worth it to spend the money to create a great and beautiful cathedral because it's a visual image of the glory of God. And, if we were to build Chartres Cathedral again, the price would be massive. But let's say we could build a cathedral like this in the Midwest somewhere, and people could come to it and they could see it and they could understand the glory of God, and they would see the beautiful imagery of the stained glass and the design of the architecture and all of the symbolism and how much it would move them. Would that be worth doing? Many in evangelical world would probably say, no, that's a waste of resource. But I guess the bishop and Johnathan Pageau would say it is worth it because it would give people a chance to see the beauty of God and the glory of God in that way. Well, what if somebody wanted to spend millions of dollars to build an ark? Is that a waste of money, or is that worth it? The stained glass windows in Chartres are beautiful, and they were a means by which the illiterate could learn about the story of the Bible because they could see the pictures and they could understand.
Stained glass was used to help teach Bible stories to the illiterate medieval masses. While the faithful back then may have been illiterate, understanding the rich symbolism in each of these windows inspired them to live their dark and dreary medieval lives with hope.
When we are separated by hundreds of years from that event, we look at it and it's foreign to us. It's not immediately apparent that that was the point. But in that day, what were the craftsmen thinking? Were they thinking that the beauty of this thing is going to last forever? Or were they literally thinking, if I make a picture, people will be able to see and understand the truth of the Bible? And, if we go back then, was it held as sacred, or was it sacred and functional in that way? And in that regard, is it any different from a giant ark with displays of pictorial and imagined scenes from the Bible and all these things? Is it different? Why are we willing to embrace the one and we're embarrassed by the other? We say that this one is beautiful, but this one was also directly based on the scripture. Now, we can build a tabernacle, or we could build a temple, and we could do those according to the design of scripture, and we would be able to walk in and see that it is a beautiful place of worship. But is Noah's Ark any different? It was the vessel that held all of humanity in that time. It was the dwelling place of all the faithful people of God. So isn't that just as sacred as the temple or the tabernacle? We have an Ark of the Covenant that carries the presence of God. Is the ark that carried the seed of humanity any less important? Because if the ark sinks, humanity's done, and Christ would never come. Now, you can debate things like local floods and global floods, but to say that those debates don't matter is wrong, because they're very important to some people. And if we get embarrassed because to support those things, it means that we lose status with our intellectual peers. Can we ever suffer for the sake of Christ? Can we actually think that in the face of physical violence we would be willing to stand up and represent Christ in the face of death if we are not willing to risk embracing him in the face of embarrassment? And I'm not saying that you have to believe that Ken Ham is right.
Why do you believe that dinosaurs lived in recent times and didn't live millions of years ago? It's usually always about the age of the Earth. It's interesting, whenever they do articles in secular newspapers, you'll often see where they say, oh, something about the Ark or the Creation Museum. This is the group headed by Ken Ham that believes in a young Earth and that dinosaurs live with people and they don't believe in millions of years. They always seem to want to categorize us that way, as if believing in a young Earth means these people are nuts.
If Ken Ham makes you cringe, as a Christian, you need to look in your heart and question, why is that so? Because he's willing to embarrass himself all the time. He's willing to say things that seem completely outlandish to anyone who will have a discussion with him. And he could merely stay within the circles of those who agree with him. It could be like the King James only people. That's a group that's so isolated that it's put such a high barrier to entry into its little club that it has no possibility of outreach whatsoever. But I think that whether we appreciate what he's doing or not, if it's making us cringe, then that's a person that we need to learn to love and pray for and understand. And I would say on the other side of this, the people who believe in creation and deny evolution, you need to understand why it's such a convincing argument to so many people. And to think that it's just obviously not true is wrong. It's not obvious. It's not obvious to the people who believe in it that it's wrong. You may feel that it's obviously wrong. But that's the wrong way to approach it. Because we can't have influence in those people's lives until we understand why it's such a compelling argument. And I would say that the way that I'm beginning to understand it is that the idea of natural selection is seductive because it almost fits on the pattern of creation that is present in the world as presented in the Bible. It almost fits. But it's wrong. It's upside down. Because it has a person who's the victor on top of a mountain of bodies. And that is the winner of the selection, because they were the fittest and they survived. But in God's plan, the person who's the fittest sacrifices themselves. And that's a very hard thing to do. And in this day, to sacrifice oneself does not mean physical death but it means to sacrifice the esteem of your peers and your reputation and, potentially your ability to make money, your popularity, your influence. That is what you may have to sacrifice. And so when we see a guy like William Lane Craig, who's extremely intelligent and very well read in so many philosophical concepts, and yet he inhabits a circle of such, these intellectuals where he is utterly embarrassed by the idea of a supernatural creation. He's embarrassed of the idea of Adam and Eve being created from dirt and from Eve being created from the rib of Adam. It's not that the evidence is so compelling. It's that he's embarrassed.
I would be disingenuous, Sean, if I were to say, I don't want the young earth creationist interpretation to come out true.
Okay.
To me, that is a nightmare. My greatest fear is that the young earth creationist might be right in his hermeneutical claim that Genesis does teach those things that I described earlier. And I say that would be a nightmare because if that's what the Bible teaches, it puts the Bible into massive, I think, irredeemable conflict with modern science, history, and linguistics. And I don't want that to happen.
To go back to the idea of concordism, the Bible and science are separate and should never meet. That's the view that you will probably never get in trouble from. You won't get in trouble for that view in intellectual circles of biblical studies. John Vervaeke's meaning crisis, awakening from the meaning crisis. He's trying to harmonize this tradition of wisdom with physical reality and life as we experience it. And the thing is that secular atheists who stand on evolution and science as such, as this is their basis for authority, are also creating concordism. But it's a concordism between science and evolution, which cannot actually say anything about how one should live. And they're using that to blend with their atheistic rejection of God and rejection of morality.
As of today, nearly all scientists, 97%, say that humans and other living things have evolved over time. Hence, 97% of scientists reject Paley's watchmaker analogy. But here's the key takeaway. Before Darwin, we didn't have an empirically substantive answer to Paley's analogy. When Paley insisted that we must conclude that organisms, with all their complexity, are intelligently designed, this seemed convincing to many of his contemporaries because evolution by natural selection had not yet been known. But today, of course, we bask in the light of Darwin, and so we can clearly see that Paley's analogy is nothing more than an appeal to ignorance fallacy. He asserted that the proposition of complexity emerging naturally must be false, since we didn't know, in his time, of any complex things emerging naturally. Now, don't be fooled, my fellow apes, the DNA argument is really nothing new. It's yet another appeal to ignorance fallacy. No one currently knows how language naturally arises, therefore language cannot naturally arise. Or, the proposition of language emerging naturally hasn't been demonstrated to be true, therefore it's false. This, I hope you can see, is every bit as fallacious, illogical, and unreasonable as when Paley insisted that complexity can only come from intelligent design.
Vast segments of society reject ideas like theistic evolution, not because it's unchristian, but because it removes the freedom afforded by pure materialism. So you would think that once the biblical scholars figure out that evolution does not contradict the Bible, that people would come in droves flocking back to the church because they can be a part of that and it would bring meaning to their life. But this isn't the case, because people who reject Christianity use evolution as an excuse to reject Christianity. It's not a reason. It's an excuse. We know this because there are such things as biologos, which is literally only a way for Christians who are embarrassed by their Christianity to be able to approach their scientific-minded friends and say, well, I believe in evolution too, and I'm a Christian. Biologos.com. But that does not bring people back to the church. It's the same thing as progressive churches who say, we've reread the Bible and now believe that we can support gay marriage and transgenderism and whatever you do with your body. It's all an act of worship. Come back to church. But what happens is that a church makes this choice, and the faithful people who were committed to the truth of the gospel leave because they're not interested in that. And the empty pews are not filled in with people because people don't want a harmony of sexual freedom and Christianity. They want to reject the moral authority of God. And their identity is rooted in their opposition of the Bible. It's not their lifestyle choices and the identity that they have is not the reason that they reject the Bible. It's their excuse for rejecting the Bible. And I think that we don't understand that. And I think that those people can see that we are the ones who do not want to be embarrassed. And you can't create genuine love out of a fear of embarrassment. And people can tell the difference. Black Lives Matter does not want white churches to support them because they want to do away with white churches. They have no interest in changing the minds of people because they are opposed to those people. So there's no way in their system, there's no means of redemption. They want to have a dualist, oppositional relationship with their enemies, and they want to do away with them. And if their enemies are just trying to win them over, it's like Poland saying, come on in to the Nazis. There's a significant sect of society that has no interest in an idea like theistic evolution because it embraces evolution as a freedom from theism. It's embracing evolution as a means to destroy theism. So, if creation science is not real science, and it doesn't produce real results, then the scientific community should place no barriers whatsoever on them trying to prove their hypothesis. Because if they did the experiments, they would be proven wrong. The quickest way to debunk a hypothesis is to do an experiment that will debunk it. not to just say that it's not a valid hypothesis.
Deposited and then hardened all over more than 500 million years ago? Or did the layers bend less than a year after the sand was deposited and then harden during and soon after the year-long global flood cataclysm, only about 4,350 years ago? Each possibility has far-reaching implications regarding our view of Earth history. Which possibility matches the data we observe in the rocks themselves? For the answer, we would have to examine the Tapete sandstone under a geological microscope to see what minerals it contains, and examine the cement binding the grains to determine if any metamorphic changes have occurred. Over 20 years ago, I began searching the geologic literature. I was utterly surprised to find that nowhere in the voluminous geologic literature, covering 150 years of research in the Grand Canyon, is there a report of any such study. In fact, the only microscope photograph of the Tapete sandstone was a black and white image in a 1945 monograph. Without any previous research to study for answers, I determined to do the necessary investigation myself. The battle begins. I couldn't just walk into Grand Canyon and start chipping away at the rocks. So on November 25, 2013, I lodged a research proposal with a research and sampling permit application with Grand Canyon National Park, GCNP, to collect 50 to 60 fist-sized samples in 4 folds and of the same rock layers from locations far away from those folds for comparison. On February 9, 2014, at the request of the GCNP staff, I submitted 3 peer reviews supporting the research proposal. Nearly a month later, I received a letter from the then chief of the GCNP research office stating that my application package had been reviewed by multiple reviewers, who had concluded that my study would not be permitted. They provided no technical or scientific objections to my proposed research. Given the GCNP's previous discrimination against creationists, Alliance Defending Freedom, ADF lawyers, got involved. They sent a Freedom of Information Act request to the National Park Service Regional Office in Denver for copies of all correspondence between GCNP staff pertaining to my research application. This request netted the comments by the 3 academic geologists who had reviewed my research application. All 3 had expressed scorn at my Christian faith and creationist worldview, insisting that my research not be permitted. Only one provided some trivial technical oversights in my research proposal. After revising the research proposal to deal with those technical details, I resubmitted the amended research proposal with another application for a research and sampling permit. This time they insisted that for my application to be considered, I first had to submit details and photographs of all planned sample sites. The ADF lawyers submitted another Freedom of Information request for copies of all research permits issued in early 2016. These permits revealed that GCNP had never made such requirements of any other scientists. In December of 2016, ADF sent a formal complaint letter with full documentation of the repeated discrimination to the GCNP superintendent, demanding the issue be resolved. Several months later, the GCNP superintendent finally replied, admitting my proposal was well stated, with methods that are similar or equal to standard scientific practice to test the hypothesis provided. Yet she repeated the demand for me to determine the sites where I plan to take rock samples, citing concerns for the environment that had never been raised with other research applications. In May of 2017, ADF lawyers filed a lawsuit in the U.S. District Court in Phoenix on my behalf against the GCNP, the NPS, and the Department of the Interior for worldview discrimination. All the incriminating correspondence was appended to the lawsuit. News of the legal action appeared on the front page of the Washington Times and in the New York Times. And it wasn't long before lawyers representing the Departments of Justice and the Interior responded to the lawsuit. After all, I was suing the federal government for worldview discrimination, because this was contrary to my rights regarding the free exercise of religious beliefs, as established in Amendment 1 to the U.S. Constitution. In ensuing discussions, the U.S. government lawyers readily admitted it was an open and shut case, and quickly sought to settle it. On June 7, 2017, I reapplied for the research and sampling permit with GCNP, and on June 23, 2017, they issued my permit. On the same day, I also submitted a research river trip application, which they granted on June 26, 2017. 2 days later, on June 28, 2017, the lawsuit was deemed settled and voluntarily dismissed. That same day, a press release announcing the lawsuit victory instigated a media flurry. Articles appeared in newspapers across the country. Reports even made it to the front page of Australia's only national newspaper, The Australian, complete with a photo of me in Grand Canyon. The lawsuit also showed up in the science media, the U.S. premier weekly journal Science, and in the newsletter of the American Association of Petroleum Geologists. In both instances, scathing comments about my academic credentials were repeated by leading academics, including one whose opposition to my research proposal was appended to the lawsuit. Why this long struggle? Why would these academics so vehemently oppose GCNP permitting me to collect a couple dozen small samples of rocks? The simple answer is that if these now hardened rock layers were bent in these folds while the sedimentary layers were still wet and soft soon after deposition, as expected in the biblical flood model, then the 500+ million years of evolutionary time on which they base their worldview never happened. But next, I would have to venture into the canyon to collect the rock samples necessary for me to find the evidence.
Are we going to question it? Who does that make us in the biblical story? if that embarrasses us as Christians, that we see another Christian doing that, and we think, oh my gosh, what a waste of money. What are we thinking? We look at a cathedral and we think the beauty of the cathedral is a good thing because the beauty of that cathedral reflects the beauty of God, and people will see the beauty of the cathedral and then they will know that God is beautiful. But we have to assume that the beauty of God is a type of beauty that seems beautiful. If God tells someone that they're supposed to build an ark, are we going to question it? Who does that make us in the biblical story? If that embarrasses us as Christians, that we see another Christian doing that, and we think, oh my gosh, what a waste of money. What are we thinking? We look at a cathedral and we think the beauty of the cathedral is a good thing because the beauty of that cathedral reflects the beauty of God, and people will see the beauty of the cathedral and then they will know that God is beautiful. But we have to assume that the beauty of God is a type of beauty that seems beautiful to us. And if we're hoping to reach those who are farthest away from God, if we're trying to attract them with beauty, is it the beauty that is a reflection of God's beauty, or is it a beauty that lines up with their perception of what is beautiful? And is their perception of what is beautiful based on a reflection of the beauty of God? Or if God, who looks at the hearts of people and sees the intention and the motivation of people, what does he perceive as beautiful? And does he perceive anything as being more beautiful than honest and earnest sacrifice of what someone has? When we look at the widow with the widow's mite, it was the most extravagant gift given because it was the entirety of that person's wealth, the percentage. But beyond that, it's not just that she gave 100% of her wealth, because somebody could go into a church with a prosperity preacher and they could say, these principles make sense, and I'm going to receive a greater blessing because of what I give. And therefore, if I give 100%, I will receive the maximum blessing. They are giving 100%, but it's not beautiful because they're doing it in a greedy way. But when we look at the widow, she gave out an abundance of her heart as well, not just out of the abundance, she did not just give all of her physical wealth, but she gave it in such a loving way that it was a beautiful act of worship. And it's the same thing with the woman who washes Jesus' feet with the perfume. And the thing is that we look at that from 2,000 years ago, and we see it as this beautiful thing. But in the moment, it wasn't beautiful. It was absurd. And anybody who knew that a woman had given all of her money in donation to the temple would scoff, and they would say, why are you doing that? And if it's not, and I don't see how it is, because after they don't get anything back from their first Social Security check, if they keep doing it, they're not doing it because they're expecting a reward. Or if they're expecting a reward, they're not expecting a reward here on earth. And so what they're doing is beautiful. But it seems wrong to say that it's beautiful because it's so foolish and it's absurd. But isn't that what God prizes? And I think that if we're in a relationship with God and we think about the way that we act in a relationship with people, when you want to woo a woman, a man may do all the stuff that makes him cool to gain the interest of a woman. But that woman doesn't know that the man is committed to her until he's willing to lay all that coolness aside and embarrass himself for her. And that is what sacrificial love is. When somebody gets up and stands on top of a table and starts singing in a crowded restaurant, then that woman knows that that man loves her. When he pulls up in a cool car, she has no idea if he loves her at all. That's the totally different thing. It's the same thing with children. Children don't want cool parents. They want parents that will get on their knees and crawl around and play with them. And I think our Father in heaven doesn't want any less. He wants us to be willing to sacrifice that which is of the most value to us. For some people, it may be money. But for most of us, it's probably our pride and our willingness to look foolish. And when we look at the person who loved God best in the scripture, we see King David. And David was a king, but in the presence of God, he was willing to strip off his clothes and dance and embarrass himself. And his wife was mortified, and she hated him for it. But God loved him for it. And so we can say it's a crazy thing and it's a waste of money for someone to build a replica of Noah's Ark. And we can say that it's a waste of time for scientists to try to, prove the Bible is scientifically accurate or whatever. But as a Christian, even if we think they're wrong, I think we need to respect the fact that they have their priority in order. if we're willing to say the Bible has no authority over one area of our life, how can it have authority over any area of our life? Because if there's one God who created everything, He's Lord of everything, He's King of everything. He's not just king of our religious rituals. And so even if, I think we have to admit we don't understand, nobody understands. We're all going to be wrong. In 1,000 years, we're not going to be having this debate. We'll be having some other debate. But there will be an account of those who lived in this time and where we stood. And God will accept us if we're just willing to be cool and say that it's cool to love God. But what He wants is for us to not care what anybody in the world thinks but Him.